Okay, I think we're ready to start. There are still participants dribbling in, but and there were some difficulties getting into the Zoom room. But I'd like to start by welcoming you all wherever you are. Thank you all for coming. We are delighted that this event has been met with such overwhelming interest. My name is Deniz Göktürk. I'm a professor in the Department of German at UC Berkeley, working on migration and culture through the lens of transnational media. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our special guest who is joining us from Berlin, the writer Sharon Dodua Otoo. Her Der aktuelle Anlass, her new novel, Adas Raum, was published just last week with a wonderful book launch, still streaming on YouTube, that was held at the Literaturforum im Brechthaus and has already become a literary event in Germany. She has been making the rounds, giving interviews to newspapers, radio, and television. She is quite exhausted, I imagine, and she has. We are delighted that you have made time in your busy schedule today, Sharon, for a virtual visit to California. We are excited to announce that our event today actually marks the book's premiere in English. All the other events so far have been in German, so this is in English now. This is the kickoff event in a series of workshop conversations with writers, contemporary writers, titled Archives of Migration, The Power of Fiction in Times of Fake News. The series will give us an opportunity to experience contemporary literature in action and to think with writers about questions of truth and fiction. The series was conceived jointly with my colleague from the Department of German at UC Davis, Elisabeth Krimmer. Hello, Elisabeth. We welcome our colleagues at UC Davis. And also I gather our colleagues joining us from Pacific University, from UCLA, UC San Diego, and of course from other universities around the country. So a very warm welcome to all of you. While the pandemic has had us confined to our homes and hooked on screens for almost a year now, on a positive note, we have all learned to Zoom and engage in long distance collaborations with greater ease, regionally and across continents. So events like this have become feasible. And the German consulate in San Francisco actually contacted us last year, asking if we might need some help, which resulted in generous support for this series with transnational writers. So thanks to the consulate and in particular to Elena Sims for her enthusiasm for this project. And it gives me great pleasure now to welcome Consul General Hans-Ulrich Südbeck from the German consulate in San Francisco, who is joining us today and will himself offer some words of welcome. Sehr geehrter Generalkonsul Südbeck.
Sehr schön. Wonderful. Thank you, Deniz. Thank you all of you who have been involved in organizing today's event. And of course, thank you, Elena, for reaching out to the universities to support this whole series. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, a very warm welcome from me in the Consulate General in San Francisco. I welcome, of course, the students, the faculty members, and all people from all the universities you mentioned before, Deniz. I'm happy that we have such a big audience. And of course, most of all, I'm very happy to meet Ms. Otoo, who, of course, I have never met before. which of course is my loss, but we'll see that. That's good. I'm very happy about today's event because the greater question we're dealing with, immigration and the contributions of immigrants to society, its culture, its economy, and its future, that greater question is crucial, not only for the US society today, but also for our German society. And I might add, also essential for the societies of most of the other EU member states. So I'm very grateful for this sequence of lectures initiative, because for very long, for far too long, German political leaders have proclaimed that Germany was not a country of immigration. It wasn't until 2001, so 20 years ago, that the so-called Süßmuth Commission concluded that this statement was untenable. That conclusion, however, does not, of course, prevent some political influences from still using that notion for their own political ends, and usually they are to be found at the far right political spectrum. Thus, even today, 20 years later, people are still debating this. That fact is more than astonishing to me, and it's quite worrisome, considering that about 21 million people in Germany, more than a quarter of the population, have a migration background. It's worrisome because not only societal realities have been ignored and opportunities for inclusive policy making have been missed, but because important voices have been excluded systematically from shaping the collective narratives and cultural identities. The decades-long exclusion of these voices has provided a breeding ground for stereotypes, practices of othering, and, in the worst case, violent racist attacks. And therefore, I'm particularly grateful that Elena reached out, that we as the German Consulate General can support the Archives of Migration lecture series. And I want to thank UC Berkeley, UC Davis, the German Historical Institute, the Institute of European Studies, and who else was involved in organizing this for doing it. I very much hope that the scheduled lectures will contribute to enriching debates about representational culture and demonstrate the contribution that culture in particular can make to change hegemonic discourses of representation. So much for that. I thought I would give over to Ms. Otoo, but I think now I'm giving back to you, Deniz, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us and for your framing remarks, very important, and for your support. And I should also mention we are grateful to the German Historical Institute Pacific Regional Office for co-sponsorship in line with their research focus on migration, particularly our Zoom Mutter, Heike Friedman, for helping with publicity and organization. The German Historical Institute held a productive workshop on archives of migration back in December 2019, when we were still able to all gather in one room. And that was organized by Fatima El Tayeb and Andrea Westermann. And our series complements that focus, that historical research focus on archives, by asking how writers of fiction activate, animate, and reimagine historical source materials. So we are expecting 2 more writers this semester, Zafer Shenojak and Yoko Tawada, and we are planning to continue the series in fall, engaging in further conversations with contemporary writers who draw on multilingual archives and bring their diverse perspectives to questions of societal polarization and the power of poetic imagination. So students in my seminar this semester on modern German literature, archival resistance, they are actually scattered around the globe in Melbourne, Shenzhen, Berlin, New York, and Berkeley. They helped to prepare for this event. And here's a shout out to Elizabeth Sun, Freya Zhang, Oliver Arthur, Giselle Lee and Ardo Ali, they all started the semester with watching Sharon Dodua Otoo's performance at the Literary Festival in Klagenfurt, where she won the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize in 2016. And we had the privilege of reading a preview copy of Sharon's book, Adas Raum, together. And we found it quite breathtaking. So I will try to relay some of their questions in the course of our conversation. But before we get there, I would like to introduce Jon Cho-Polizzi, who is the true initiator of this event with Sharon. He was the one who told me about her forthcoming new novel a while back and mentioned that he had submitted a sample translation to the publisher Fischer Verlag, which has meanwhile been posted on the publisher's website. And we are hoping with him that he will be offered the translation contract for Adas Raum or Adas Raum or Adas Raum as his translation goes. So Jon holds a recent PhD from the graduate program in German at UC Berkeley with a dissertation titled A Different German Village, Writing Place Through Migration. He served as managing editor of the Berkeley German Department's electronic journal Transit for many years. He is a prolific literary translator, has translated works by José Oliver, Max Czolek, and other writers. So as the initiator of this event, Jon will introduce Sharon Dodua Otoo. Before I hand over to him, I should mention that the audience today will have the opportunity to ask questions or share comments via chat, or I think it's via chat, right? Yes, via chat. Jon and I will do our best to keep an eye on the chat. Sharon will be reading some passages from her novel, but she told us that she's mostly interested in running this as a conversation, also learning about readers' and listeners' responses. So with that, welcome again, and over to you, Jon.
Thank you, Deniz, for the introduction. It's both a great pleasure and privilege to introduce Sharon Dodua Otoo today. Author, activist, publicist, and mother, Sharon Otoo has already published several Berlin-based works of English language fiction when, in 2016, her German language novella, Herr Gröttrup Sits sich, in English alternately, Herr Gröttrup Takes a Seat or Herr Gröttrup Sits Down, won the coveted Bachmann Prize for Literature, catapulting Otoo to the forefront of German language literary fame and advancing her as a de facto voice of this generation. Eloquent, introspective, bold, and tangibly present with a wit at once as subtle as it can be biting, it is not hyperbole to suggest that Otoo's unique brand of fiction has already transformed the German literary scene. As a German language learner herself, Otoo's sensibility for, and indeed sensitivity to the German language, has provided her the ability to not merely navigate its intricacies as an informed outsider, but to transform and expand its potential for communication. And in doing so, expand the scope of literary expression for a new creative generation in an increasingly post-migrant Germany. A generation characterized not simply by its adherence to so-called traditions, but by its capacity to continually redefine the fluid boundaries of what it means to be German today, to speak in German, to write in German, to live, dwell, and be visible within the German-speaking world. Fans of Otoo's award-winning and recently translated 2016 novella, or those of us who have also read her works of English language literature, such as the 2012 The Things I'm Thinking While Smiling Politely, or the 2014 Synchronicity, may already be familiar with some of the aspects of Otoo's writing which characterize its unique style and voice. Her works have variously been described as combining elements of magical realism and Afrofuturism with traditions from feminist literature, works of identity politics, empowerment, and contemporary activism. Otoo herself has cited literary inspiration in the writings of authors such as Toni Morrison, Heinrich Böll, Max Frisch, Bertolt Brecht, and Maya Yim. Her own works have been compared to those of such divergent artists as Loriot and Virginia Woolf. In the end, it remains Otoo's own singular capacity for storytelling, which renders all of these many comparisons both apt and woefully insufficient. Today represents the US and English language premiere of Sharon Dodua Otoo's debut novel, Adas Raum, a multivalent title which I've somewhat inadequately translated as Adas Realm, the German Raum meaning simultaneously space and realm, but also quite concretely room. Just one piece of supporting evidence for comparisons I've recently heard drawn between layers of the novel and Virginia Woolf's groundbreaking essay, A Room of One's Own. But Ada, or perhaps Ada's room, is in truth greater than can be contained by any four walls, even if one orbital loop of the narrative is told from the perspective of the four walls of a room. The novel follows the intersecting lives of four women across more than 500 years, four Adas, whose lives coalesce around the fate of a single artifact, an ornate golden bracelet, stolen from West Africa by Portuguese colonists in the 15th century and variously reappearing across the centuries in the proximity of young women named Ada, Ada, Ada. Although each woman's life runs independently, all four's fates are intimately entwined with that of the bracelet. Each woman's life, each search for recognition, retribution, or redemption becomes part of one greater story, a narrative of resistance and rebirth, which becomes inextricable from the experience of life in the globalized network of the post-colonial world we all inhabit. Each woman's journey is narrated from the perspective of an inanimate object, inhabited by a single consciousness, unmoored from our human concepts of space and time, an all but omniscient narrator, constrained by the physicality of its earthly form, a broom, a brass door knocker, a passport book, a room. The limitations of each narrator's perspective add subtle weight to the power of their narration, suggesting questions which remain unanswered in the novel, carrying over into our present-day understanding of the historical moments in which each narrative loop revolves. When Sharon contacted me in the late fall of 2020 to ask whether I would be interested in providing a sample English translation of her debut novel for her publishers, I must confess that I felt both a combination of elation and terror. I've been a fan of Sharon Otoo's work for years, eagerly following recent developments in her literary career and its various intersections with German studies in the English-speaking world. I had coincidentally just reread her essay Liebe, Love, from the 2019 collection Eure Heimat ist unser Albtraum, Your Homeland is Our Nightmare, a poignant examination of the trials of Black motherhood in a white-dominated German society. And I was moved by its ongoing relevance in the growing conversation around the Black Lives Matter movement, which was still resonated with the global uprisings around the public murder of George Floyd. I was thinking of the particular impact of the essay in the context of an intersectional collection by young German language authors intent on using a collective literary platform to advance their individual perspectives, thinking about the relevance of what they had deemed practices of radical diversity in the construct of present-day German life. And I was thinking broadly about the power of such intersectionality and the message which such a collective work could represent for the fractured identity politics of contemporary US activism. I'd also recently read the work of my friend and fellow translator, Patrick Plushnitsky, who translated the American English version of Herr Gröttrup Sits Down, along with Judith Menzel, and their assertion that their translation, as two German-speaking immigrants into the US-American culture, provided a fitting translation for an author who had herself emigrated out of the English-speaking world and into the German-speaking one. I was wondering what exactly my contribution to this new translation might be. An English-speaking descendant of Korean, Jewish, and Italian immigrants, a frequent migrant myself between the English, Spanish, and German-speaking worlds, living on the west coast of North America, and translating into the American idiom for a Black British woman author, writing in what is effectively both of our adoptive tongues. It struck me that the power of this particular work of literature, Adas Raum, lies precisely in the scope of its accessibility, its ability to tell a story which is at once profoundly bound together with the unique life experience of its author, and yet also speaks so directly to the experiences of the modern global world. Narration in a voice which transcends histories. The translation of such a work becomes much more than a translation. It is a conversation around mutual understanding of what it means to live and write, both in and in between life worlds. I'm used to conversing with the authors I translate for. Many German language authors today speak fluent English, and these conversations often invite new perspectives or interpretations, much more than simple questions of comprehension and reiteration. I'm not, however, used to discussing my translations with an author who could just as easily and just as creatively have written the original work in English, her mother tongue, as well as mine, a daunting task. Sharon, however, quickly assured me that she would not, in fact, have written this text in English. That part was up to me, as was defining a distinct language for each era and each Ada. A broader conversation ensued, voice messages, shared documents, comments and response, which ultimately granted me a wholly different insight on the original text, alongside a level of artistic freedom in interpreting these passages of the novel, which proved invaluable. The conversation, I believe, is broadened by many points of intersection, as much so as by points of divergence. A complex of difference and similarity negotiated on the page, converging in this case somewhere in cyberspace between London, Oakland, and Berlin, a growing constellation. The language of the original text is mostly German, but this is a story which belongs not only to the German-speaking world. The novel places the inheritance of West Africa back into its rightful place at the center of the transatlantic sphere, tracing and translating the trauma of the colonial era alongside the resilience of the post-colonial, across the sea from what would become Ghana to Portugal, England, Germany, and back. A story which pushes deep into the roots of the colonial past, linking it inextricably with the post-colonial present, alongside the layers of violence of the 19th and 20th centuries, which still inform our comprehension of today. The novel leaves in its wake questions of accessibility, circulation, and birthright, privilege and purpose, which are as relevant here in the diasporic communities of California as they are in London, Accra, or Berlin, deconstructing and rebuilding Virginia Woolf's proverbial room of liberation across a global realm, Adas Raum. And now, without any further ado, I'd like to turn the virtual microphone over to Sharon Dodua Otoo, who will be reading and discussing several short passages from her novel and inviting questions from our virtual audience. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you so much. I think that deserves a great round of applause. What an introduction. Thank you so much. As I was listening to, thank you to everyone who's welcomed me, and thank you to everybody who's here this evening for this event. I'm overwhelmed by how many people are participating. Actually, this is really wonderful. And as I was listening to the introduction, John, I just kept thinking, oh, I'm learning so much from what you're saying. And I also thought, oh, did I really write that? So I'm really excited about this opportunity to discuss the novel in English with people who understand German or who understand what I was trying to do, perhaps in the German-speaking context. I haven't spoken about the novel very much in English before, so it might get a bit bumpy. Adas Raum, as John has already said, the title is really important. I wanted to choose this title. I didn't have the title straight away, but at some point I realized this is the title for my book. I think in the second year of writing. I've been writing this novel for 4.5 years. When I realized I wanted to use this title, the feedback was lukewarm because I believe part of the process of creating a book involves marketing. And who wants to buy a book called Adas Raum? So I had to sort of convince the publishing house, the Verlag, that no, this is the right title. There is, of course, I could have called the roman Ada or Ada, and there are other novels with this title, so there could have been a way to linking with those other novels. But I felt that that would be the wrong title because it really isn't a novel about a single person or even the four women. That wasn't my aim, to write like a biography or a very straight narrative. I wanted to talk about, yeah, space, time, room. I wanted to think about continuities. I wanted to think about the effect of trauma on present day. And yeah, it occurs to me every time that somebody introduces my novel and talks about the 500 years, I think, yeah, what a way to like spread out. I really took up a lot of space with this narrative. So, and I think that there's something in the fact that as a Black female author writing in my second language, that I decided to take up so much space with this novel. There's something in that too. So I think that I'm very grateful that the Verlag eventually agreed with me that Adas Raum was the correct title. And yes, I wanted to think about room, like a physical room that people need. My character in 2019 is looking for a place to live. I also wanted to think about the concept of safe space. What does it feel like to be Black and female in a country that is predominantly white, where there are experiences of racism and sexism? How can you find a space within this environment? I also did want to think about space in terms of space travel. The Ada Lovelace in 1848 is credited with being the first computer programmer ever. And the Ada or Ada in 1945 is, okay, how do you say Zwangsprostituierte? Forced prostitute in a concentration camp in Germany called Mittelbau-Dora. And that was the place where the V2 rockets were produced. So there's a thinking about how the space race and its links with war and weapons. I wanted to think a little bit about that, technology and war, technology and violence. Yes, and as I've said, just the concept of time and space. So the novel doesn't only take place in these very different time periods, 1459 in West Africa, 1848 in London, 1945 in Kornstein by Nordhausen, and then 2019 in Berlin. But it also takes place in a realm called Asamando, which is, now how would you say that in English? Jenseits, it's like heaven, I guess, or the beyond, what happens in the afterlife. But this is also the before life. This is in the concept of the novel, where we all are before we're born and where we all return to after we've passed away. So there's different levels and spaces that I've taken up in this story. Why did I do that? I did that because I had written this short story, Herr Gröttrup Sits Herr Gröttrup Sits Down, or Herr Gröttrup Takes a Seat. This story was not originally intended to be, it's going to sound strange because it won a literature prize, but it wasn't intended to be a work of literature when I first wrote it. It was intended to be an explanation using literature to describe what critical whiteness is. Critical whiteness I'll summarize as what it means to be a white person in a predominantly white country. So what does it feel like? How do you move when you're privileged and you don't really know that? And I was asked to write a text about critical whiteness. And I thought to myself, well, there are a lot of essays and books on the subject already, and I don't want to reinvent the wheel. And I'm assuming that the people who already know about critical whiteness have access to those texts. And the people who don't know about critical whiteness and maybe can't understand the concept and maybe reject it without really getting more into it, trying to understand it, maybe they could be reached with a text that works on the level of humor and creativity and a little bit of confusion. So that was the idea behind Herr Gröttrup Sits Sich. And I wrote this text. Everybody who writes knows how much you fight with texts and how much you struggle to get to the deadline. And I was so good. I got the text in on time, and then the publication never happened, which was highly frustrating. And then the text just ended up in my Dropbox for a couple of years. I wrote it in 2014. But it turns out that that was a really good thing, that that text wasn't published, because for the Klagenfurt competition, the texts that are introduced in that competition have to be unpublished. And so when I was asked by the jury member, Sandra Kegel, when I was asked if I write in German at all and if I perhaps have a short story in German, that was the only text I had. I hadn't written really in German creatively before that, or since. Apart from this novel, I'd done a bit of, I'd had a couple of goes, but actually that was really the main thing that I'd ever done. I didn't know the competition. That was also lucky, because if I had known, I would never have sent this text in, because any text that's had been published or had won the prize before 2016 was nothing like the text that I wrote. So I sent it to her thinking, well, if it works out, it will be nice, but if not, I'll stick to my day job. And then she really liked the text. I think the text works on many different levels. So that's the beginning, I guess, with this description of a typical older German heterosexual married couple, and their morning routine and their breakfast routine, and the the kind of banter between Mann und Frau. I think that grasped the imagination of some people, and then there was something quirky in a Black British person describing that. I think it reminded a lot of people of this L'Oreal sketch, which I really didn't know before I wrote that scene. I was well annoyed when I found out someone had already thought of it. And then what, of course, no one expects is that the egg, suddenly speaks. And the reason I chose this, it took me a few days to come up with that. I was trying to emotionally capture everybody, of course, the readers, but also my two characters up until that point. I was trying to catch them and shake their routine and shake their privileged understanding of how the world works. And the only thing I could come up with was that this egg had decided that it was going to refuse to take on the consistency that Herr Gröttrup knew scientifically it was going to have. So once I decided that it was the egg that was going to speak, I then had to figure out why would an egg speak? And that then became a story about something that I call Wesen, or being, that has taken on many different forms, and on that particular day wanted to be an egg. And the reason that I did that, I might never have said this in public before, but what I wanted to do with this story was not to point my finger at older heterosexual white German men and say, you guys don't understand everything and let me teach you. That wasn't my point at all. So I needed to have an instance in the story, and there's a line that says, I didn't even make it that far. The being hasn't even made it to be born, hasn't even made it to the stage that Herr Gröttrup has already reached. So it isn't about me criticizing anybody in particular, but just saying, look at how it works, look at how these structures work, and how the structures can hinder you. They create dead spots or dead angles and hinder you from seeing certain things. That was the point. And so to include this figure, this being that hadn't even reached that far, was part of me trying to make that message more palatable. So I've got a very complicated concept of this being that's lived all over these different years. And then there's this cleaning lady that shows up right at the end that seems to have an understanding of what's going on, and that if the married couple had lowered themselves to her level to speak to her, they would have accessed that knowledge too. That is a lot for a short story. So at some point it was clear I was going to have to expand to explain and describe all of that in more detail. And that's what I then did with the wonderful opportunity that I had when I won the prize, the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize. I was able to actually, I actually did give up my day job. I became a full-time writer. I got an agent. I got a contract with Fischer Verlag. I also got 2 writing stipends. So I was really put in a completely different space in terms of my professional career as an author. And I took some time to write this novel. It wasn't an easy novel to write for all sorts of reasons. But that's how it came to be and why it took the form it did. It was important to describe something that I feel, which I also recognized in Jon's introduction, which is my understanding of the world isn't so neatly categorized. My own biography cannot be neatly categorized. And I think actually nobody's can, but yet we keep trying to make these very clear, neat categories to fit in with. And so I wanted to write something that would bring the reader through an experience of directly feeling on their own bodies that things cannot be neatly categorized. Yeah. So if anybody's reading this novel and feeling confused, that's that's the point. Would this be a good time now for me to read a little bit?
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
great. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what
Give
I'll
us
do,
a taste.
I'll give you a taste. I'm going to be reading in German. Hopefully that I won't lose too many people. There will also be a little later on a reading of the English translation of the section that has been translated so far. I'll begin though with an introduction of the 3 different Adas or Adas that appear in the first part of the book. So I'll begin with the very first one. That's the very first page even. It's set in a little coastal village called Totope. And this scene is set in March 1459. In der längsten Nacht des Jahres klebte Blut an meine Stirn und mein Baby starb. Endlich. Als es nur noch wimmen konnte, berührte Nalamle seine Wange. Schön, dachte ich, dass das seine letzte Erinnerung sein wird. Sie lag direkt neben ihm, das Kind in unserer Mitte und ihr Kopf ruhte an meinem. Nalamles Augen schimmerten, als sie mir versicherte, dass es nicht mehr allzu lange dauern würde. So Gott will. Sie flüsterte, hauptsächlich weil alle unsere Mütter auf der anderen Seite des Zimmers schliefen. Aber Nalamles Stimme wäre ihr sowieso versagt. Zusammen hatten wir die letzten 3 Nächte an der Seite meines Babys gebetet und geweint. Ich hörte sie kaum und verstand sie noch weniger. Während sie es streichelte, hatte sie mich angesehen, als würde sie sich über meine Irritation wundern, wobei der Satz, woher willst du das wissen, meine Lippen nicht verließ. In einer Situation, die ohnehin nicht auszuhalten war, war dies ein besonders abwegiger Moment. Nalamle wusste immer Bescheid. Ich wollte ihr gegenüber in jenem Moment, in dem es buchstäblich um mein eigenes Fleisch und Blut ging, nicht wieder einmal so ahnungslos wirken. Die Notlösung, mich an der Stirn zu kratzen. Kratzen und dabei vergessen, dass ich Blut unter den Fingernägeln hatte. Okay, and the next section that I'm going to read is an introduction to the figure Ada, very, very heavily lent on the real life person, Ada Lovelace. Yeah, I want to say one more thing here. In my book, I use a lot of different languages. And while I was writing the languages, it was fine. I could hear these languages in my head. But now I'm coming to present it in public and I have to actually pronounce these different words. I do have my limits and I don't speak French. But in this section, Ada Lovelace does speak French, and she refers to her lover as Charles. And I can't really say that, but you have to imagine that that's a wonderful, beautiful French accent. Okay. Stratford-le-Bow, März 1848. Ich blickte auf ihn zurück, während er sich anzog. Zunächst die Strümpfe, anschließend die Hosen, nie andersrum. Dann erst sein Unterhemd zweimal ausgeschüttelt. Er befürchtete, das Oberhemd würde sonst nicht richtig sitzen. Die Spitzen seiner eleganten Finger umkreisten die Hemdknöpfe, einen nach dem anderen. Und er zitterte vor Wut. Cher Charles. Ich hätte den Streit mit ihm vermeiden können, wenn ich ihm uneingeschränkt Recht gegeben hätte. Das pflegte ich meist zu tun, denn es war äußerst strapaziös, gerade in jenen Zeiten, Dispute mit Männern wie Charles zu führen. Männer, die sich eigentlich für die Guten hielten, doch zwischen den Schwarzen auf der einen Seite und den Frauen auf der anderen nicht mehr wussten, woher die nächste Anfechtung ihrer gottgegebenen Autorität kommen würde und deswegen vorauseilend an allen Fronten kämpften. Seine Gewissheit, dass er mir irgendwas Gescheites zum Thema Wahrscheinlichkeitsrechnung sagen konnte, war denkbar lächerlich. Korsette haben wohl nicht nur auf Frauen eine einengende Wirkung. Okay, und dann, the third part is the section that takes place in the concentration camp, in a brothel in Kornstein bei Nordhausen, März 1945. Ich weiß also nicht mehr, wie sich Schmerz anfühlt. Ein gestoßener Ellenbogen, Liebeskummer, Brennen im After, das alles würde darauf hindeuten, dass mein Körper mir gehörte. Aber was für ein seltsames Konzept. Ich kann damit nichts anfangen. Das Zeichen, dass ich ein Leben zur Welt bringen könnte, ist weg. Es ist, als würde meine Gebärmutter mit mir schimpfen, du passt ja überhaupt nicht auf. Deine Vergangenheit hast du verloren, deine Gegenwart haben sie dir geklaut. Ich gehe jetzt und nehme deine Zukunft mal mit. Selbst das Armband meiner Mutter ist weg. Reichsbesitz, wie ich es auch bin. Mir gehört gar nichts mehr. In der Sammlung von Momenten flüchte ich meistens in einen rötlichen, schwebenden Raum hinter meinen Augenlidern. Von dort kann ich das Geschehen aus so etwas wie einer wissenschaftlichen Distanz betrachten. Ich kann, aber ich will es nicht. Ich will es nie. Okay, that was the 3 sections to start off with. Shall we do some kind of discussion? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, since we already touched on translation, this is probably a good time also to pick up a little more on that. So if you writing this book in German, how did you come to write it in German? I mean, because it spans, sort of 1458 Ghana, then Victorian London, then 1945 the camp, and then the present also, which did not come up yet, but there's also quite a long section about Berlin 2019. But the language, and it also strikes me that the novel is really a reflection on life as a continuous process of translation. So because in all these 4 settings, there are multiple languages come into play and rub up against each other, and creating disjunctures in communication, different accents. In Ghana, there are at least 2 local languages are mentioned, and Portuguese, and then Victorian London, you already mentioned French and Irish, not to forget,
Yes, and sign language.
Yeah. And then in Dora Mittelbau, it's German, Polish, there might be Yiddish around as well. And then in contemporary Berlin, it's everything. It's German, African languages, and many other. So, but if you could say a little bit about writing this in German, and then dealing with the multilingualism in all these different eras and settings, and that might also sort of connect to Jon now translating this into English.
Yes. Sure, I can do that. So I've talked a little bit about how it came to be that I was writing in German, and of course there was a time very early on when I could have decided, even having won the prize, I could have decided I'm going to write it in English. That might have been, I was going to say it might have been easier. On a certain level, it might have been easier, but on another level, the subjects that I was discussing, and indeed from the subjects that I had touched on in the short story, this wasn't going to work in English. I would be missing the mark. It would be like trying to cook a recipe with different ingredients. Yeah, I want to make a certain kind of cake, but I've only got cheese and carrots or something. I just felt like I wouldn't be able to find the words for the story that I wanted to tell if I had started in English. And also, of course, the audience would have been a completely different audience. I wanted to write directly in this context for the people who also share this context with me, and pick up on discourse and themes that are happening in Germany at this present time. And then I guess there was also one other thing, which was a little bit of a rebellion, to be honest, in me, was there is a concept, I think, let me begin with my parents. My parents came to London in the 60s. They moved from Accra in Ghana to London. They moved separately, but met in London, got married, had children. And it was strongly encouraged that they spoke English to their children, right? And this idea that families and individuals who come from another context and then are living in Europe and are being told, if you want to get on well here, if you want to do well educationally, if you want to get a good job, then ditch your traditional languages or the languages you grew up in and assume the language of the dominant society. This is what my parents did. This is what I hear people, politicians saying in Germany all the time, that people, for example, I'm just plucking this out of the air, but for example, Turkish families who for generations are passing Turkish down to their children and grandchildren, they are viewed as not willing to integrate, and they're told they should be speaking German at home. I don't understand language to be so, is the word hermeneutic? I just don't get it. I think that language doesn't work like that. I think communication doesn't work like that. And I lost a lot, I think, in my childhood because my parents felt that they shouldn't speak their own mother tongue with me. I think that created a kind of a distance, which is really sad. And I regret that because it also meant that whenever I'm in Accra and visiting other family members, if they don't speak English, then we don't communicate. I didn't communicate with my grandparents, for example. So when I thought about the discourse around multilinguality in Germany, I felt very frustrated about it. And I felt that it must be that the people who say you have to speak German to your children in Germany, otherwise you're not integrating, they must be people who only speak one language themselves, right? And have no idea of how this works. And also then I thought about it and I thought, I think even more in German than in English, even more in English than in German, English is a language in and of itself is a multilingual language, in my opinion. You have different flavors of English. You speak differently in Australia than you do in the US, than you do in Scotland, than my parents do in Ghana. So, or even if you only grew up within within England and Great Britain, you will speak differently if you meet with the Queen to if you speak with your friends. And I think that language is a lot to do with context and a lot to do with relationships, people that you meet and interact with. And how I speak English to my children is very much different to how I speak English with my family in London. How I speak German with my children is very, very different to how I speak German in an office where I'm trying to get some documents or something. So I was kind of feeling frustrated about this discourse about language, this idea that you have to keep German, you know, with its Sprachreform and everything's correct and it's in the Duden, and if it's not in the Duden, it's incorrect. And I thought, yeah, I don't subscribe to that. And I wanted to show that in a living, functioning, I think, society, it is already very pluralistic and people are speaking many, many different languages. Some languages, of course, are more acceptable to be speaking than others. So it's okay if I speak English to my children mostly, but if I was speaking Arabic to my children, that might not be so okay. You know, that's the kind of thing I wanted to explore with the novel.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, it also strikes me, of course, that you had to, you know, I'd like to hear a little more also about the sources that have been woven into this narrative. So, you know, to really kind of flesh out that 1458 setting in Ghana that vividly, as you do in the novel, was probably harder than fleshing out Victorian London, you know, because that fiction was much more available and accessible.
Yeah.
But, you know, sort of what went into this in terms of sources in all those languages would be an interesting question.
Yeah, yeah. The 1848 sections that involved watching a lot of Pride and Prejudice. And whatever. What did I read? I read the beginning of David Copperfield. I already knew Great Expectations. I felt like I had 1848 down, right? And then pre-colonial West Africa is not something that crosses your path so often if you're not looking for it, you know. So that was more difficult, but it wasn't that hard actually. One of the people that influenced me a lot was Akala, I think I'm pronouncing it, Akala, who is in the UK, a young Black rapper who also, I would say, is a historian. He's written a book, I've forgotten the title of his book, but he's written about Black British history. And he talks a lot about history, pre-colonial Africa. And I really love how he does that, how he makes it really accessible. He uses it also in his music. I then went on to think about, this comes up every now and again, thinking about same-sex relationships. It comes up every now and again that there were same-sex relationships in pre-colonial Africa, and that the missionary, and also concepts of gender anyway, were not as fixed as they became when the missionaries arrived, and there had to be, you know, cities with a head, there had to be families with a head, and then patriarchy was deemed to be the most stable form of doing that. And it interested me to think about that. I would have loved to have made that more explicit in the novel, that that's what I was referring to, but I didn't want to be didactic with the novel. So I think it was the right decision to just show that there was this same-sex relationship, but not explain why. So I did a little bit of a Google and read about, how it was that there were certain roles, that a role of somebody who owns land and who gets married and looks after the family, that was kind of a male role, but that male role could be taken up by a woman if the oldest son had passed away or something like this. It wasn't so fixed. And then I also was in Ghana. When was I there? 2017, I think. 2017 or 2018, I went back for the first time in 15 years. That was very, very strange, because all my cousins, the last time I'd seen them, were 15 years younger. It was like time travel. It was very strange. And while I was in Ghana, I had many conversations with people about concepts of religion and concepts of the afterlife, and if there's such a thing, the before life. So a lot of what I did was informed by conversations I had with people. I also visited the University of Ghana at Legon, which is in North Accra, and they have an archaeology department. And that was where I first thought about, the gold mines, what the Portuguese were anyway doing there, taking this gold and how that all fitted together. But yeah, I wasn't trying to write a historical novel. I wasn't trying to, there is a lot that's based on fact. And then there is a lot that actually, if people dig hard enough, they'll realize, okay, that couldn't have been true. That couldn't have worked. I can tell you an insider that's not possible, if you like, to make it worth it that you were all here this evening. One of the, in one of the sections, which is 1459, it depicts the death of Ada. And the way that it's described, it's clear that she was shot. She was shot to death. And what I can reveal exclusively for tonight's audience is that it's not possible for her to have been shot to death in 1459. Those guns, I mean, not with the amount of rain that I describe in that scene. And it would have been a very heavy gun, and it would have needed a lot of work to get this fire and gunpowder to all of that. I decided to take artistic license and just have her shot anyway. So I did some things there where I kind of like, okay, for the benefit of the story, so that all the 3 death scenes feel the same, that's what I want to do. So why did I do that? Because it's not a historical novel. It's supposed to be a novel about emotions and triggering ideas and associations.
Excellent, yeah. So back to the language question, we have one question here that we can pick up, and then we should probably get to the English translation.
Yes.
So, for the sake of time, but this might be a good connector. So, the question is about, other writers. Ruth Klüger, for instance, translated her memoir Weiterleben herself. So, why are you not translating your own work? And then also, would you say that you're a different kind of writer in German and English? This comes from Elisabeth Grimmer.
Yeah.
So, and yeah.
Yeah. So the second part, definitely, I'm a different author.
Yeah.
I think many people who speak more than one language might have this experience as well, that when they speak their first language, they're clever, intelligent. And when they speak the other language, they sound somehow younger, a little bit more unsure of themselves. I'm a different persona. And so part of my struggle with writing this novel was trying to find confidence to say, okay, German isn't my first language, but I'm still committing these words to paper. I'm still trying out this sentence structure. I'm still gonna see if I can fit this image into the story, and does it work as a whole? That took some courage, to be honest, to do that. And then the first part of the question was, oh yeah, so look, I don't like translating anyway. Like, I don't even like translating shopping lists. Like, I'm not good at it, right? And I find translation as a discipline, I think it's something that requires a great amount of creativity, a great amount of insight. Like a person has to read a text and not just find the words, but actually capture the emotion of the text, or capture the sort of inhale what the writer is trying to communicate to readers. And because each reader is different, there could be different things that need to be communicated, right? Or arrive at the reader. I would say there's no one right reading. I think I can say that, yeah, there's no one right reading. So for a translator to have to make this decision, okay, of all these different possibilities, like Jon was saying, with the different possibilities for the title, to translate the title, which one do you head for? That's a decision that I don't I already did the work of writing the thing, so the interpretation of it for an English speaking audience would mean that I would have to fix myself down. So for example, I deliberately chose Raum as a word in German that I I don't know what else to choose than realm, but realm misses other things. And for me to then say realm is the translation in English would make the German title, what's the word, more eindeutig, more, you know, it would fix the German in a way that I didn't intend in the original. So I kind of am refusing to commit myself to doing that, yeah. And it's hard. Translation is just hard. And thank you to Jon for doing it and all the other translators out there.
Well, that's a good cue, Jon. You want to read?
So we'd spoken about whether we want to read a particular passage. Sharon, have we decided on a passage that we're both going to read?
Yes.
1848?
Yes.
Okay. Would you like to read the German first to give the audience sort of a feeling for that? And then
yes, I
can
do that.
Follow after?
Shall I read a section?
A section is good, I think.
Sure.
I'm just trying to think, how far shall I go?
And then am I going to pick up from there? Okay.
Okay. I'll go to, on page 44, er hatte Dickens gesehen, okay? All right. Stratford-le-Bow, März 1848. Den Kopf eines Löwen zu verkörpern, war für mich keine leichte Sache, da ich noch nie ein Lebewesen gewesen bin. Es half weder, dass ich aus Messing gegossen war, noch dass ich einen schweren Ring in meinem stolzen Maul trug. Ich wollte niemals ein Tier sein und darum auch nicht annähernd wie ein Tier aussehen. 1848 wurde die Form des Löwenkopfs für den Türklopfer von 37 Battersea Road gewählt. Es ging darum, gewisse Eigenschaften wie Stärke, Schutz und Macht auszustrahlen. Sachen, von denen ich nichts wusste. Auch hier war der Gegenstand, zu dem ich werden sollte, ohne meine Zustimmung festgelegt. Ich hatte noch nicht angefangen, das gewohnte Verfahren in Frage zu stellen. Meine Möglichkeiten, Einfluss auf das Geschehen zu nehmen, begrenzten sich auf die täglichen Berührungen mit den feinen Gästen. Die mit den Reithandschuhen hatten oft gar keine Chance und hielten mich für defekt. Die mit den fingerlosen, bestickten Handschuhen aus Seide mussten mehrmals klopfen, bis sie von der übermüdeten Zoffe beachten fanden. Das war amüsant, aber auf Dauer auch anstrengend. Und ich sehnte mich danach, wieder ein ausdrucksloser Besen zu sein. Von der Haustür aus hatte ich einen ausgezeichneten Blick auf Charles' wütenden Abgang. Und nicht nur ich. Es wirkte vielleicht für Außenstehende so, aber es war kein Zufall, dass Adas Ehemann Sekunden vorher im Battersea Road angekommen war. Er blieb noch einige Minuten an der Ecke zu Nummer 37 stehen, lange nachdem sein Konkurrent im Nebel verschwunden war. Und auf einmal war ihm nicht mehr nach Schlaf. Sein Hunger war verschwunden, ebenso das noch vor wenigen Momenten recht dringliche Bedürfnis, eine Gosse oder einen Baum zu finden. Der jüngste Vorgang hatte endgültig den Rahmen gesprengt. Er hatte Dickens gesehen.
Naturally, scuttling after the scoundrel would have been below the bearing of Lord William King. He would not confront him, no, the time for friendly exchange had passed. He would not imprecate him. It was even too late to slap him across the face with a glove, a lovely fantasy which for a moment brought a smile to William's lips. He fingered the pistol in his coat pocket. Communications concerning his wife's behavior had reached him in Paris, including word that she was entertaining an uncautionable friendship with a novelist. Had this remained at just one or two whispered commentaries, he could have dismissed it as simply more Ada hearsay. He could, at his next convenience, have taken the knave aside and advised him to take care that no further rumors of the kind proliferated. It was clearly too late for a civilized solution. He had seen the rascal with his own eyes. 10 times it was that William chafed for not being able to bring his reason better under control. 10 times more he felt the same sharp twinge in the pit of his stomach. At the 11th, he slammed his right fist against the wall and managed not to cry out. The skin over his knuckles split and he welcomed the external pain. How ironic that he had returned unscathed from the catastrophe known as France, only to be wounded in slumbering England. The whitewashed facade had seen a rude, red awakening. He examined his bleeding fist and snorted. He would tend to Mr. Charles Dickens in good time. First things first. Where was Ada? Since Ada simply lived for mathematics, William assumed that she would already be sitting at her writing desk at this intolerably early hour. Secretly, he suspected that she was not so much a countess, but rather some kind of counting machine in human form. He almost wanted to see this woman, his wife, the mother of his children, run weeping, perhaps even pleading from the house after Dickens, to see that the unscrupulous rogue meant something to her, at least, that she maintained the ability to feel deep-seated emotions like desire, ardor, or even hatred for another human being, that she possessed a heart of flesh and blood at all. The moon was already fading, but the mist had not yet fully risen. William faltered, recognizing moments later that it was merely shadows he saw lingering defiantly in the alleyways. A few birds twittered. Could they already be house martins? What cause did they have to be so merry? The time was right for a dramatic scene to unfold, to hammer on the ring in my mouth at number 47, until the heads of households appeared in their starched nightshirts at the neighboring doorways. William shook his head. No, he was consideration personified. He would never do such a thing to his comrades in misery. In only a few hours, they would be leaving their homes, neatly dressed, prepared, and in high spirits. To be sure, only after first offering some words of consolation to their anxious wives. The latest developments in Paris were enough to raise concern, even in female heads. They also saw the papers. They too could put one and one together. No, William would by no means rouse these fine men from their precious sleep. It was the good ones, like Dickens, who had no sensibility for their fellow man. This hero of the toothless masses was, in principle, worse than a simple egoist. With his so-called art, he deluded everyone into believing he intervened on behalf of the rights of the poor. He could certainly arouse passions, but what more? Who truly cared about Oliver Twist? Surely, even the most obstinate chartist must acknowledge that the average worker in Great Britain was far better off than in any other European land. Why, in France, he wouldn't even have freedom of assembly. Paris was burning for good cause. William grasped my ring a little too tightly and pounded it 3 times against the door. I knew he was expecting Lizzie. Where else should she be? He anticipated her sleepy footsteps on the spiral stairway and was planning to instruct her after a portentous moment's pause to summon her mistress. But a few moments later, we heard instead how Ada herself sprung down the few steps from the first floor to the foyer. William's restive heart skipped a beat. You may only come in if you promise me not to run away again. Ada grinned as she opened the door. She had prepared to continue her teasing, but the words caught in her throat at the sight of William. She stood gaping at him. It was written all over his face. This man, her husband, the father of her children, had seen Charles. She grew pale. After a good half-minute, he cleared his throat. I will not run away, he said. It is about to rain. I could sense how every single hair on Ada's body rose. There had been no indication in his last message that he would be returning so soon. At times, she had even thought he might have perished in the Parisian flames. And she had been startled because she had felt neither grief nor shame at the thought. His appearance robbed her of her speech. But where, how, since when have you? I was impressed that William could retain such composure. He said only, where is your bracelet, Ada? In this way, we arrived at the matter without delay. And I was grateful because the storm had already announced itself with the first drops of rain. Of course, in 1848, Ada possessed any number of bracelets. Luckily, it was not in her nature to stall for time with unnecessary questions. She knew he meant his wedding gift to her, an exquisite trinket made of pearls which exuded a splendid, rare, white golden hue, a bracelet he had inherited from his mother. According to tradition, she had received it from her husband, William's father, on their wedding day. And William knew that Ada knew that he knew. She hadn't the foggiest idea where the precious bracelet could be.
That's beautiful, and it also gives us a sense of how this fluid narrative consciousness moves into objects and in and out of people and objects, and it brings up that bracelet, which you know, I'd like to bring this up at the you know, sort of in the second half of the novel. It appears in Berlin, and it actually appears also in an exhibition catalog. So that raises all sorts of questions about how that non-European artifact and, you know, piece of art and heritage is displayed in the new Berlin. And so I was, you know, thinking about the discussion on animism that occurred at your book launch, you know.
Yeah.
So that's, but also about, you know, the Kulturforum in Berlin, which is now housing the ethnographic collection, you know, exhibiting all this non-European art at the heart of the capital. Very controversial project, you know. So you know, your novel seems to engage with all these debates in a sort of light, imaginative way, and also, you know, that probably dovetails also with your political activism. Yes. In Berlin today. So that is a question that students really wanted to ask, you know, what is the role of fiction in your political activism, but also engagement with this kind of heritage, you know, destination tourism, the appropriation. So, you know, this is the year also not only of Black Lives Matter and, you know, kind of protests against structural racism in the US and in Europe, but also, you know, all these symbolic battles around the renaming of Mohrenstraße, for instance, after the Black philosopher Amo. Yes, Anton Wilhelm Amo. So maybe you could say a little bit about that whole kind of you know, starting with the bracelet, but then also the kind of the broader context of putting that non-European heritage, authentic artifacts on display in the Berlin context today.
That's a very big question, and there's 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes, 9 minutes. Okay, but yes, I can say happily something about that. Of course, it's a really nice question. The bracelet in the novel travels through the different eras and ends up in 2019 in a museum. Of course, I was thinking very much about the Humboldt Forum and the Benin Bronzen, like things that are currently in Germany. And there's a discussion about restitution. How were these goods acquired? How, if at all, can they be returned to their countries of origin? And because of that, because of the ongoing nature of the discussion, it was really actually a conscious decision of mine that we don't see the bracelet physically anymore. It ends up in this museum, and there's a discussion about who does it belong to. Two of the figures in the novel, two older West African women, say they refuse to go to the museum because why should they pay to see something that belongs to them? And there's a scene, I'm just going to tell the story of the novel now, shall I? But anyway, there's a scene right at the very end in the hospital where the man who the bracelet belongs to offers to give it to Ada, and she says, you can't give it to me, it doesn't belong to you. And that was a deliberate move to say, yes, these artifacts may still be in the museum today in 2019 or 2021, and they may be there for another few years to come. But eventually, the diasporic communities are clear that they will return. We want them back. I say we as part of the diasporic community. We await, and we don't want them to be returned in some kind of, okay, we'll give it to you because we're so generous, you know, but with an understanding that there was a traumatic event involved in bringing those goods from their countries of origin to Europe, and there has to be some kind of recognition of that, some kind of space allowed for mourning, some kind of space for an apology, and then I want to say auf Augenhöhe, so that there is a respectful exchange. At the moment, the conversation around restitution is, for me, very lopsided. It's very much European actors saying to West African actors, do you even know the value of this object? Do you have a museum, actually? You know, and it's so disrespectful. So it was important to me that the novel doesn't end with the bracelet just happily being sent back to West Africa, to say, no, it's in a museum and we all know that it's there and we're waiting for the right moment for it to return. Yeah. Have I forgotten the question? What was the other part of the question?
Well, the other part is the bigger activism question.
The activism.
Fiction and activism.
I'm going to quickly paste a link in the chat. I read an essay called Forget About the Facts by a wonderful author called Olya Alvia, and I've just posted the link to this essay or article. I think it was a talk, actually, and I find it really great. Olya basically says the most powerful way to affect social change is through storytelling. People don't really remember facts, or even if they hear the facts, they kind of doubt them, you know, and it doesn't connect the same way. If I say how many hundreds of people were shot dead by police officers in the United States in 1982, yeah, cognitively we understand it, but the storytelling, the reason why we feel moved to tears is not through the facts, but through the story and through the connection on a human level. And that is something, that's the chance I see. I'm not a particularly good, I don't know, I'm not going to physically fight any Nazis. That's just not my strength. I'm not a particularly good organizer of demonstrations. That's also not my strength. But what I have practiced very hard and tried to learn is how to put words together on a page in such a way that I can make connections that people associate with on a deeply personal level. And that's the level that I'm trying to, I think we all come at anti-racist work or anti-discrimination work from different areas, and that's my road in. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. I think I didn't see that link, Sharon. Did you post it?
Oh, because I sent it to Susan.
Ah.
But Susan has forwarded it to everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Great. So I think it's time to move towards, you know, sort of concluding words, statements, wrap up. Any burning questions that haven't been answered? So we have about 4 minutes left.
I mean, I would really love to hear about people's, for people who've read the novel, what it meant to them, what came across. Yeah, I would love to hear some of that.
Perhaps if there's audience questions, maybe people can raise their hands on Zoom, and then we can know which audience members would like to make a comment.
Mm-hmm. There is a question about women's friendships in Adas Raum.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it actually dovetails also with response I had from one of my students who said, it's such a strong female voice, that was, and sort of women's friendships, it might be something to comment on.
Yes, I can comment on that.
You're welcome to write further comments into the chat. The audience, that might be kind of more, and I will try to save the chat before.
I can very briefly talk about the women's friendships. I think I started to write the novel, and originally there were many more. In my memory, I had also a few male characters more than ended up in the final version of the novel. I also originally had the actual short story, Herr Gröttrup Sits Sich, as part of the novel. I ended up cutting that. It was a very painful decision. And I'm sorry for the people who were thinking that they would read this book and find the story in there. But in the end, I decided that the story was about Ada, or Ada, who originally was this unscheinbare Putzfrau, this figure that we didn't know so much about and we were underestimating. And to center her story, I needed to think very much about what makes Ada Ada. Who are the people who strengthen her and who influence her and who she influences? And when I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about her story and her history, it very quickly became apparent that history in general is told often from a very male perspective. We find out about what the male protagonists did. We find out about wars and the strongest and the fastest and the heroes. And I thought it would be nice to look at the little stories that were also relevant, but we don't normally read about in these factual history books. And I even kind of make a jab at that with one of the Portuguese captains. What was his name? Diego Gomez is a figure in my book who he says one or two things and disappears again, but he was a historical figure. I found his name on Wikipedia. He was a real historical figure. In my roman, I kind of take a light-hearted jab at this concept that these historical figures were also, they were always so competent and heroic. And I kind of write that he got it a bit wrong. He got lost he was looking in the wrong place for the wrong guy. But later when he writes his memoirs, he'll delete all of those parts and make it look, clean. And so that was an idea that I came up with, or I came up with in discussion with my editors very early, that I wanted to focus on Ada and things that were important to Ada. And so then it naturally came that there were important women around her, the women who raised her in 1459, her what do you say, Troya's Hofer, her loyal, trusty servant in 1848, the only person she trusts in 1945. These had to be other women. And then in 2019, the last Ada has a sister who lives in Germany, and she goes to live with her sister. And I'm not saying that these are perfect relationships. In 1459, there is violence, right? These community of women use physical violence on Ada, and in 2019, Ada and Elle have this like little conflicts and kind of get on each other's nerves, but that is part of the love. All of it, it's a very complicated love that they're expressing to each other. I just wanted to make space for those kinds of stories in the novel.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, I see two people so far have also brought up graphic novels. You brought up Google multiple times as a source, but
yes,
but there's also Priscilla Lane actually writes there about the necklace that changes hands and travels of the world in Birgit Weye's graphic novel Reigen, which was partly inspired to write by Schnitzler's Reigen. So somebody else told me that there is a French bande dessinée novel which is actually titled Ada or Ada.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether that's also part of the kind of general realm of imagination that comes in.
At some point these works of literature speak to each other, right? And they exist in the same space, and people bring them into contact with each other. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we are reaching the end of our time. This has been so much fun. Thank you both, Sharon and Jon, so much, and thank you everyone in the audience for participating. And there is a chance to enter a breakout room if people want to talk a little more. I think Heike has kindly set that up for us. But otherwise, we all, I think everybody is writing that they're looking forward to reading the novel. It was a little soon after the publication.
Yes,
so
I'm very sorry for all the spoilers.
I think it worked to inspire people to go read it. So in that way, I think we've done something for the book. Yeah, it's been a great pleasure, Jon and Sharon, and we'll reconvene in the breakout room for a moment. Yeah, okay.
Sure. Thank you very much. I really had
you.
a great time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much.